I get going then? Okay, well, I think I can say good afternoon to everybody by this stage. And yeah, thank you very much for allowing me to give you this presentation, which I've entitled The Language of Separation, Experiencing a Good Enough Separation. And it kind of actually dovetails nicely into what Claire's just been saying, because I was thinking about her talking about shame and guilt and all of those kind of internal reflections that we have and tussles we have with ourselves. And I think this presentation is more about the external factors that impact our sort of thought processes and approach to or journey through separation. So hopefully this one following the last won't be too much overlap, but is quite complementary. And I just stood back a moment ago and thought, what is the overall aim of my presentation? And I think it's to ask everyone to think about their framework to achieve a safe and healthy separation, and to really ask what can help with this and what is unhelpful to you, because there are lots of messaging that we receive from all different sources that I consider to be really quite unhelpful. So I've started the presentation just by essentially asking us all to acknowledge that separation is never going to be perfect by its very nature. But sorry, I've just noticed something different on the slide, that's okay. But it's a recognition that things need to change. And really to say that children don't need, they don't need parents to be perfect. They just need to know that parents have done their best. And I should probably say actually that my background is as a child law solicitor. So for many years, I helped parents sort of try to sort out arrangements for their children, whether that be without needing the court or needing the court process. And I then trained as a mediator. So I've gone on quite a journey really in terms of where I think, you know, it's most helpful for parents to try, as at least as a starting point, to sort out sort of how they want their future to look like. And I've just put a quote on this slide from Sir Andrew McFarlane, because he at the moment is the president of our family court, and we're really fortunate to have him in England and Wales because his background is a child law specialist as well. So he's got a real interest in supporting families to come to sort of the healthiest, most sustainable outcomes that they can. And bear with me, I've got a dog here because I'm looking after a dog for a couple of weeks for a friend, and I'm not quite sure what the dog does in terms of barking and so on, and the postman's just knocked on the door. Anyway, what Sir Andrew McFarlane has said in a book that I'm going to recommend later in the presentation by a lady called Jo O'Sullivan, who talks about all the different ways that you can sort of processes you can use to support you through a separation, is he essentially says that you know, those that end up going through court proceedings and fighting a case often have a true loss in terms of emotional and mental well-being and money. And those who can achieve a good divorce or separation can achieve something of value for themselves and for their children. And part of coaching, I think, is to really explore with parents what they want their separation to look like. And as a solicitor looking back on things, I think what often happens is people don't have an awareness of a process in the first place, or they get into a process and then the process takes on a life of its own. And that kind of leads you down paths that you wouldn't necessarily go down if you stood back and reflected on it further down the road. So at the moment in the family law world, there is sort of a great movement towards, and you've heard Belinda talk about this earlier, a movement towards a more sort of holistic and supported approach to families who are going through separation, rather than just sort of assuming that they've got to go to a solicitor or they've got to go through court proceedings. And there's some really good lobbying groups. And one of the main ones at the moment is a group called the Family Solutions Group. and they've written a really good report, followed by what we call a language matters paper. And a lot of what I'm saying in this presentation comes from that paper and the thinking around sort of how we approach separation and make that more supported for families. And what they say in that presentation is that words we hear and use shape our mindsets, which in turn affects how we think and behave. And I think we've heard from several of the presenters how they feel that's sort of impacting the way people approach separation. And again, it's been said a couple of times today, but just an example of this sort of negative perception that's still around about separation. There's negative things that crop up in the press. There's negative things that sort of perceptions of people in the school playground. And as I've just said, I think this sometimes feeds into how people's journeys then unfold, because they sort of develop a mindset about it, and it kind of takes on a life of its own. And you know, what I wanted to say is that separation is a very normal event. I think somebody gave some statistics earlier, but 42% of marriages, for example, is the statistic I read yesterday, end in a divorce. And actually, the research shows that those who stay together for the sake of the children are actually worse off in terms of their own well-being and their children's long-term outcomes than those who take what is understandably a very difficult step into the brave new world of separation. And this slide is just to give an example to sort of where these external messages keep coming from. So I just Googled custody battle on Google, and I came up with a couple of articles straight away. A look inside Hollywood's most bitter celebrity custody battles. That's an article from last year. And then one from that was Daily Mail, one from the Guardian, which begins in custody battles over the past few years. Well, custody is a word we did away with sort of 35 or 40 years ago with the Children Act. Its aim, sort of, it suggests kind of control, or I don't know what it suggests, but it's a very loaded word, and it's a word that's an archaic word. And yet, whilst it's not in any sort of laws or any approach to separation within the family law world, it's still something that's used in common parlance by sort of people in their homes, in the school grounds, or in the press and things like that. And the Family Solutions Group is very much trying to take this on. And what they say is that the responsibility for separating families at the moment sort of rests more or less with the Ministry of Justice. And the Ministry of Justice looks at things from a sort of legal, court and justice aspect. So it's often thinking about what justice I need if I separate, which isn't at all what we know families need and children need. They need sort of support from their parents. And this continues like directly within the family law world as well. So there are lots of people, if they're looking for somebody to represent them, for example, they'll look at what we call legal directories, and there's two. There's one called Legal 500 and there's one called Chambers and Partners. And there's still these descriptions of lawyers, such as one I just pulled up randomly by having a quick search the other day. It said, if you need a fighter and someone who will robustly pursue an argument, she's the barrister to go for. Well, that flies completely in the face of what the majority of the family law world and all the other professionals who work in supporting families want, but it's still there. And that language impacts sort of what we think and feel about the right way to have a good separation. But I've put at the bottom of the slide that there are these green shoots of change, because of course we've had no fault divorce laws that have come in the last year, and that means that we no longer need to have sort of as a prerequisite to starting the divorce proceedings negative messaging about the person who we separated from in order to get a divorce up and running. That's a really negative way to start off the process of separation. And we've also had the Domestic Abuse Act, which I think is a hugely key piece of legislation in this, it's for England and Wales, that ensures that if somebody is on the receiving end of any kind of form of domestic abuse, and I think Belinda listed out a very broad list, then they should be able to go to the court and seek the protections and have that acknowledged, and not feel as though they can't, obtain what they need to protect themselves and their children. So that, again, that's another really positive step. And then just to round off this slightly sort of negative part, I feel, of the presentation, Helen Adam, who chairs the Family Solutions Group, she did an article recently that just summarised what they're trying to help us to move away from. And it's all this negative language about fights and battles and so on, and to move towards a language that should reflect problem solving, and just very much be a more sort of positive and constructive approach to how you consider your own separation and who is supporting you through the steps required. So I've tried in the next slide to just put together some sort of tips, I guess, for what you can think about in order to move forwards constructively. And I've put a qualification at the top that when I come on to talk about the different language and so on later in this presentation, I am not advocating for a moment that any language that's very constructive and balanced and impartial and so on should minimise anyone who's been a victim of domestic abuse or anything like that. And when I was thinking about this presentation, I was thinking about, I think, many of the families who end up in the wrong processes, either because they're not given the right information, because perhaps the professionals they support don't have all of the right information to give them in the first place, or whether they just start in processes and the processes run away from themselves. And when I was a solicitor and I used to help clients going through court processes, some of them absolutely needed that. You know, there was difficult domestic abuse or substance misuse problems or some other kind of serious problem that required the support of the court. But there were families, I think, who were just caught in conflict and a bit lost. And for whatever reason, maybe one side wasn't prepared to shift, and it just led to lots of time, expense, and in the end, a sort of shared care arrangement. But many months on, when all the damage had been done and lots of money had been spent, and it just was a sort of negative way to get from A to B. I think it's really important to have an understanding of what children need. And there is a huge amount of information now. And one of the most important things is that children, we need to avoid sort of what we call chronic interparental conflict. So children can take a separation, they can take parents arguing and so on and so forth. But the difficulty is if it becomes really chronic. And I wrote an article recently just to try and reassure people about what this actually means. So there's different types of conflict, and in the sort of journal articles that are written about it, it talks about it being destructive conflict or constructive conflict, and it talks about it being on the silent to violent continuum if it's destructive. And actually, you don't have to have perfect conflict skills for children. Children need to see conflict. They need to have role models and parents who can resolve their conflict constructively. But that doesn't mean they have to agree on anything. Of course, they haven't if they've decided to separate. It means they can do things like they can reach a full agreement. There can be a partial agreement. They can agree to disagree. They can apologise to one another. So it's not as difficult to achieve something constructive for children as you might think. And the other interesting thing about all of the research is that I think people would assume, and I certainly found this interesting, and I've heard researchers talk about this more recently, that if you just ignore somebody or you close off the conflict, so that's what we call the silent end of the silent to violent continuum, that would be less troublesome to children than if you're screaming at each other. But actually what the research has shown is anything on the silent to violent continuum is equally damaging for children. So you often get one partner who just ignores, closes off, won't talk. And actually that is very difficult for children. And when you explain that to people in a coaching context or a mediation context or another context, then it just helps people to move a little bit more towards the middle and think about what is a way that we can each tolerate some constructive communication in order to help our children's long-term well-being. There's also a shift in the research in terms of moving from looking at the negatives and what we call adverse childhood experiences to looking at the protective factors, because actually children, if they have protective factors around those adverse childhood experiences, can fare very well. And so there's having a consciousness about what types of things help to support children and are those protective factors. And one of those is that children really benefit from multiple attachments. So if they've had a good relationship with an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent, or a mentor at school, for example, if the separation suddenly means that they can't maintain that relationship, then that can be really difficult for them, because that can be one of the protective factors that helps them. And I often talk about the Dr. Robert Emery research because I find it really powerful. But he's an American researcher, and he's undertaken this, what we call longitudinal study. And that means that he's followed families. I think he followed them for 12 years. So he gets some really rich data about the differences between the processes that families use and their long-term impact. So what he did was he arranged with a court in the States of America that when parents applied for help to sort out the arrangements for children on separation, he randomly assigned half, I think there were 75 families in total, but half went into one group and half went into the other group. One half just carried on through the court process. They'd made their application and they carried on. The other half came and had 5 or 6 hours of mediation as a prerequisite before they either then had sorted things out or had to carry on in the court process. And so he got some data initially that showed lots of them who came into mediation could sort things out. But then he followed both sets of families and asked detailed questions over a period of 12 years. And after 12 years, he could see that the ones who'd gone through the mediation, both parents saw children more often and spoke to them more often. And really importantly, the parents in the mediation group rated each other as better parents to the children than those who had just gone through the court process. So by trying these things, coaching, mediation, if they're safe and appropriate to do so, you can help to establish a new relationship that is really going to help your children to fare well in the longer term, according to lots of the research studies. Another thing, I've heard it said in the conference, I think more than once, but looking after yourself is so important, because again, it's not about being the perfect parents. Children just need good enough parents. But if you're really really suffering and you're not able to, what they call, attune to children and sort of identify when they've got needs and meet those needs, that can be difficult in itself. And the very first step is to make sure that you are okay. We've heard it said, I think Claire said it in the last one, don't get brought down by others. Try and seek out support that's impartial and can help you, as Claire said in the last presentation, really think about things and challenge yourself and create your own authentic story that is going to help you through your separation in the way that you want it to be, as in terms of all the things that you can control. We know there are things you're not going to be able to control. And yeah, choosing the right process. I'll come on to mention this a bit, but people get stuck in the wrong processes. And actually, it's about really researching what all of the processes are and having an understanding of what they mean, so that you can step into the right process and you know what your options are, because again, that really affects the journey that you're going to go on. So I don't want to say much more about this, but I like to read the research and I like to try and understand it as best I can, because I think that helps us to sort of support parents in the best way possible. And there's somebody called Professor Gordon Harold who assimilates lots of this research and puts it together. And again, he's focusing on the protective factors. But if you try some of those, which is what I mentioned a moment ago, he has shown or he has reported that there are clear improvements for children in terms of their mental health, behaviour, school outcomes, and long-term relationships. So just a record for you there of the types of things that he says it can help. This is just a list. You've heard quite a lot of them, and I've added discernment coaching on, Sue, following your presentation yesterday, of lots of different things that can help you. And I mentioned earlier the book by Jo O'Sullivan called Almost Anything But Family Court. She's written this book and it summarizes all the pros and cons and realities of all the different sort of options that are out there for you. So, for example, if you come into mediation, as Belinda said, it's a completely voluntary process. It's a completely confidential process, but it's a safe space to have a conversation. And you can go off and have something called an early neutral evaluation, which is where you are sort of given together the parameters for what's a fair outcome in the eyes of the law. I'm talking about England and Wales, but you can probably have it in Ireland or any of the other places where there are delegates attending today. And there's just different things that can help and be appropriate to your own set of circumstances. But the book summarizes everything and gives you a really good introduction so that you can then speak to a professional to see, what they think might be the most suitable process for you. This is a very badly put together slide, I'm afraid, but I hope you'll be able to follow my intention by it. And when I'm coaching with clients or sometimes in mediation, I use this. It was in the wrong colour scheme and it's gone a bit wrong when I've tried to translate it today. But I ask parents to look to the very top line, the top horizontal line, and I ask them to identify sort of what are the characteristics of a relationship as romantic partners and what are the boundaries of that. And then we talk about how it's a skill to step down to the next line, which is to have the characteristics of a new relationship, which is as cooperative parents. It might be parallel parents. It depends on the circumstances and what this family needs in order to function well and safely for children. But there are different boundaries, and we talk about sort of what are the boundaries of a business relationship, for example, and where are the trigger points and what is it appropriate to have communications about in that new relationship, that so that you don't stray out and trigger off and then things move from the constructive realm into the destructive realm. You can plan things like, how are you going to deal with difficult communication when it crops up? Some people go back to mediation repeatedly. Some have a third party or a family member that helps them mediate it. But it's generally about the fact that if you don't think about these things consciously, you fall, I think, from one role to another. We can do that in lots of different areas in life. And it just sort of happens. But when you actually spend time and invest time to think about what is happening and why it is happening and how do I want that to be, the experience is a better one for everyone concerned. And I just wanted to bring this to life with a real life example. So a bit like Claire a moment ago, I asked Bob Grieg, who is one of the people who runs Only Mums and Only Dads, if I could share a post that he'd put onto LinkedIn a couple of weeks ago, and he was very happy for me to do so. I'm going to find it on my sheet because everyone's video faces are right over the text. But essentially, he's just telling the story of his own separation journey. And he was saying that 15 years ago, he found himself caught up in the bewildering world of family courts, and that it was really difficult because it was in relation to his daughters. And clearly that is something that is hugely important to anyone when they're going through a separation. And he says the months passed, the court case increased, and he became more and more unsure of what was in the best interests of he and his ex-partner's daughters, and everyone's world was turned upside down. And he walked away from the court building feeling like he'd been in a spin dryer and could barely think. And I think we can all relate to that in one way or another, even as a professional in those situations. It was really hard to walk alongside someone and to know what they were going through, and knowing that the court process doesn't always produce the kind of experience or the outcome that anyone wants, really. It's just an outcome that people then have to live with. And he was saying, that the decision that the court was having to make was was a huge one that was going to last for 12 years, more likely a lifetime. And he says in his post that he just wanted the judge to come over to his house, see him cooking for play dates and to see children on the trampoline and so on and so forth. But instead, he got the environment of a family court with its reports and hearings and formal wear and formal language and airport style security and hard hats, and it all seemed a million miles removed from him, his girls and their mum or any family. And he then says, a year or so later, at yet another hearing, and things changed. A new solicitor arrived at court, no names, but they had been instructed by mum. That solicitor's focus was all on the girls, and he says he could sense for the first time that someone got it. They really were putting the interests of the girls first, and what a difference that made for all of us. So I think it's so important to ensure that the professionals that you choose to work with you, because it's a really privileged position to be one of those professionals, are people that understand, what the right way is to support you if you're going through a separation, and very, very critically if you've got children. So the last couple of slides, I've pulled them from the Family Solutions group. And the first one is just to give a sort of guidance on what children really need if you're going through a separation and safety isn't a concern. So I'm not going to repeat them, but they're there for you to have a look at. And the last one is just, again, because, this presentation started off being about language, then it got a bit derailed when I was preparing it, but I just wanted to bring it back to that at the end. There are all these words that stick with us. I don't know why they stick with us, but I think they sit easily with a relationship breaking down and the feelings that are associated with that, and kind of fear about what's going to happen. But what we know is that, things like custody is a really unhealthy word. And the focus of the Family Solutions group and this movement across sort of the world of professional supporting families now is to really help parents to understand that it's actually about children's needs. It's not about parents' needs. It's not about ownership of children or anything like that. It's about parents' responsibilities for their children, and just changing the language and changing the mindset of everybody, professionals and the press, and all of these things can just help the experience to be a more sustainable and positive one for the family for the remainder of the children's lifetimes. It's not just what happens in that sort of difficult 12-month period, but it does last a lifetime. So that's it. I hope that was interesting, and I'm happy to answer any questions.